Hey, everybody. It is Thursday, April 11th. You're listening to the Mo News Podcast. I'm Moshe Wanunu.
And I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to. Jill, just a heads up to everybody as they begin this podcast today. If you're a Mo News Premium member, you get a second podcast today. I've done a deep dive into the new Nickelodeon Quiet on Set documentary, the most streamed documentary in America right now, with Kate Roberts. She's the reporter who broke the story first 2 years ago for Business Insider. You might have seen her in the documentary. We dive into the story, what prompted it, what they've learned through the doc, why some people wanted to talk to her and why others wouldn't. So I think you'll find that conversation fascinating, and also an indictment of child actors and the industry around it and the amount of reform that is necessary. So you can check that out as a Mo News Premium member over on the Premium Pod. And I should mention, Jill, if you're not a premium member, it's just $7 a month, and you can find us and you can sign up over at mo.news/premium and also get access to our members' Instagram account.
Speaking of most streamed, Moshe, we do have some data confirming what we probably knew. On Monday, Spotify says searches for the 1983 song Total Eclipse of the Heart rocketed up about 50% before the solar eclipse. Not really surprising, but I actually am surprised it wasn't more than that.
I agree, just solely based on the number of times we played it on our Instagram feed, which is at least like 7 or 8. I would have expected a higher climb, but listen, I think there were about 50 different songs related to the sun, shadow, eclipse that you could have played as your soundtrack for the eclipse on Monday. So hopefully Bonnie Tyler enjoying some royalties this year. We'll get to a good vacation. It appears she's turning 72 this June. Jill?
Well, we'll have to mark that on this day, Moshe, so make note of it.
On it.
Okay, let's get to some headlines. The first ever limits on forever chemicals in drinking water, what it means for you. To the Middle East, where Israel is bracing for a potential direct attack from Iran or one of its proxies, and concerns that it could majorly escalate fighting in the region. To the U.S. economy, and a surprise to absolutely no one who has been shopping recently, inflation is still coming in hot. The big debate about the debate. TV networks are banding together to urge President Biden and former President Trump to commit to a debate.
This was never really an issue for the past few decades, but after the interactions these two had in 2020, it's in doubt this year.
The FBI director says he is worried about an ISIS-K style attack like we saw in Russia here in the United States. We'll tell you what he had to say. Our planet just experienced the hottest ever March, making it the 10th record-breaking month in a row. And Mattel is out with a new version of Scrabble. We'll tell you why.
They're trying to make it a more collaborative, less stressful experience, Jill. Are you a Scrabble player?
Not in years, but not because it was stressful. Just haven't had the chance to play. And Moshe will have on this day in history.
Houston, we have a problem. On this day in history.
All right, let's start with a story that will impact almost all Americans. For the first time, the EPA has set legally enforceable drinking water limits for a group of the most dangerous chemicals, what are called forever chemicals. And with at least 45% of the nation's tap water estimated to have one or more types of what's called PFAS, there could be major implications for the water industry. PFAS, which stand for a very long chemical term, which I am not even going to attempt to pronounce, are a group of thousands of chemicals that are linked to a host of health problems. And the CDC reports that nearly every American has them in their blood because they're pretty much everywhere. Yeah, from nonstick pans to electronics, PFAS are used to make products that resist heat, oil, stains, and water. They do not naturally break down. They do get into the drinking supply, though, and are linked to cancer, birth defects, and other serious health problems. There are about 15,000 PFAS synthetic chemicals. Since 2016, the EPA's advisory health limit was 70 parts per trillion for two of the PFAS that they track, the PFOS and PFOA. I know it's complicated, but it is kind of important just to clarify what we're talking about here.
Yeah, again, Jill, you mentioned 15,000 different PFAS out there, and they're only able to track a certain number of them. And they're trying to get at the ones that are most present and potentially most harmful. Notably, the reason for this change here is that research last year showed that there was actually no level of exposure that is safe when it comes to PFAS in drinking water. So the whole idea that there was a limit of 70 parts per trillion for many critics and health experts said, why are we stopping at 70 parts? And so what the EPA has done here has lowered it to 4 parts per trillion, the lowest detectable level of PFAS. That's the new standard here that they're looking to implement. It's the first time in nearly 3 decades that the EPA has implemented new drinking water limits for contaminants. And public health advocates here are cheering the new limits. They say are a bold first step towards addressing the PFAS situation, something they said was no issue in the past, and now they're taking it more and more seriously. So while the EPA has only focused on 6 of the chemicals, the treatments that water utilities will now use to remove the PFAS you mentioned, Jill, will also remove other chemicals of concern. So we're talking pesticides, pharmaceuticals. Yes, there's pharmaceuticals in your drinking water, personal care products. Many of them are unregulated in the current Safe Drinking Water Act, and we know that they have serious health effects. So one of the effects of these new rules on the main PFAS will likely help clean up the water from these other chemicals. So as far as time frame here, public water systems will have 5 years to address their PFAS problems, 3 years to sample their systems and get to the right level, and then an additional 2 years to install water treatment technology if their levels are still too high. Now, water utilities across America have installed technology to address many of the chemicals, but many of them are not happy about these new regulations. They've been fighting it. They say it is way too expensive. We're talking about 66,000 different public water systems in America. But as of the numbers, we're seeing only about 6 to 10% of them need to take action to bring down these PFAS levels. So while PFAS are omnipresent, it appears that really about 10% of them, up to 10% of them, are the real problem water systems. As far as cost, the change is going to cost companies about $1.5 billion per year. Now, the U.S. government has set aside money to help. The most recent infrastructure law set aside nearly $10 billion to help with PFAS removal, to help pay for the treatment and new technology here. Now, of course, if it gets to be more expensive than that, these costs could get passed along to consumers. And that's what your water companies are saying is like, listen, if you want more expensive water, this is what happens. So ultimately, that's been part of their pushback here, is that this is going to make your water bill more expensive. At the same time, studies have found that these PFAS do have a health impact. And you see the government taking action here.
Moshe, I was reading some of the comments on the Instagram post about this story, and the consensus seems to be, get us clean drinking water here. I mean, it doesn't really matter what the cost is. We're willing to pay a little bit more to not have these forever chemicals in the water. Right.
The government's like, yeah, we understand you're talking about cost. We also think there's quite a cost to people getting cancer, heart attacks, and strokes. So we will take the health benefits of cleaner water, even if it means slightly costlier water.
Okay, now let's head to the Middle East, where Israel is waiting for an expected strike by Iran and its proxies, who have threatened to retaliate against Israel for an attack in Syria last week that killed a top Iranian general. President Biden on Thursday vowing that the U.S. commitment to defend Israel against Iran was, quote, ironclad. There is concern that there's going to be a significant strike from Iran within the next days. And this is notable because it comes despite his criticism of Israel for the way that it's been carrying out the war in Gaza. Axios is reporting that the senior U.S. military commander in charge of the Middle East is expected to go to Israel today to coordinate around a possible attack. This is significant because an attack on Israel or its bases could lead to another escalation in this fighting. A direct attack from Iran would be unprecedented. And Moshe, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think that that is really what is expected here. But if that were to happen, officials say Israel would retaliate with its own direct attack against Iran.
Right. The sense is right now that Iran doesn't want a direct war with Israel. Iran doesn't want a direct war with the U.S. And so what they'll do, as you mentioned, the proxies, what are we talking about? The Houthis, Hezbollah, the other Hezbollah that they have in Iraq, Islamic Jihad, the various terror groups that they fund and arm across the region, that somehow they'll involve them in a response after the Israelis killed a number of top Iranian military commanders in a strike in Syria recently. So the Iranians have been talking a big game. Now it's become a bit quieter. The Israelis saying, you attack us, we're going to take out sites in Iran proper, a direct war. In fact, it's been rumored about that the Israeli Air Force has been practicing strikes on Iranian nuclear sites. Remember, they're close to develop. Remember, they have a nuclear program. They haven't quite developed nukes yet. But the Israelis, for a long time, have been practicing missions taking out those sites if the Iranians get too close. So a lot of talk here from the U.S. and the Israelis trying to basically send the message to Iran, be careful what you do here. So like we tell you often in this part of the world, each side needs to get its revenge. The question is, what is the scale of it? What does it look like? And how far do they go to prevent a wider escalation? So that's something we'll be watching. Remember, we thought it was going to happen over the weekend. We're now headed into another weekend here, and the Iranians haven't responded yet. So clearly deliberating as to what their response will be to last week's strike. As for the war in Gaza, we've been talking about these on again, off again, on again, on again talks for a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. Those talks have been happening mainly in Cairo. The Israelis have put forth several offers, including an offer the U.S. said yesterday that Hamas should take, and the fact that they're not taking it shows how little regard they have for the Palestinian people. Hamas now saying they've rejected the latest ceasefire offer. Again, this is a 6-week offer here. They say actually that they don't believe they have 40 living Israeli hostages who would be needed for the first stage of the ceasefire deal.
Right, that would fit the criteria. Women, elderly men, men who are sick.
Right. It's believed that there's 136 hostages still in the Gaza Strip. Until recently, it was believed that 100 of them are alive. And that entails both young men, old men, women, etc. The first part of this deal would be an exchange that would require Hamas to release people in that specific category. Now, Hamas claiming publicly, there's not enough of them alive for us to meet the 40 number. Now, the one thing that we've learned about Hamas so far is that they've lied several times about who's alive, who's not alive as a negotiating tactic. So unclear here whether this is a tactic or whether they're being straightforward here, but that's one of the major obstacles. There's also frustration in Israel that they're starting to give away too much, that ultimately they've taken it up to 1,000 Palestinian prisoners who would be released from Israeli jails, including 100 who've committed murder and are serving life sentences right now in Israel. They've also boosted the amount of aid. A record amount of humanitarian aid has come into the Gaza Strip in recent days. And of course, the Israelis have already removed the majority of their troops from the Gaza Strip in recent days. So the belief is that Hamas actually doesn't have an incentive to compromise here, that things keep getting better for them, that they're watching an increasing divide between the U.S. and Israel, increasing criticism of Israel. So Hamas, they're totally cool just sitting this one out. They don't really care for the Palestinian civilians and their state of play. They've said multiple times in interviews publicly that everyone should expect to potentially have to suffer as part of the resistance against Israel. So as far as Hamas is concerned, the longer they wait here, the better deal it is. So that's one of the major obstacles. And that, again, is frustrating folks in Israel and now increasingly frustrating American officials. A couple clips, Jill, we posted in the last day on Instagram from Secretary of State Blinken have gotten collectively almost 2 million views. I'll play one of them right here. He is talking in this press conference with Foreign Minister of the UK, David Cameron, about the fact that the Israelis are doing more on humanitarian aid, the need for them to do even more on humanitarian aid. But then he takes a moment here to call out Hamas, criticize them for not taking multiple ceasefires. He again says that shows the disdain they have for the people of the Gaza Strip. And his issue is that many allies around the world, he says, have effectively erased Hamas from the picture here, even though they deserve criticism for starting this entire war. Take a listen.
So much of the understandable passion, outrage, and anger directed at Israel for the plight of Palestinian civilians in Gaza, but some of that might also be reserved and directed for Hamas. It remains astounding to me that the world is almost deafeningly silent when it comes to Hamas. We would not be where we are had they not chosen to engage in one of the most horrific acts of brutality and terrorism on October 7th, and had they then, having done that, not refused these many, many months to get out of the way of civilians, to stop hiding behind them, to put down their arms, to release the hostages, to surrender. Where's the outrage there?
So it's interesting, Jill, the administration here trying to call balls and strikes on both sides. But for the most part, in the last couple of months, given the domestic political situation here and the terrible relationship that Joe Biden has with Benjamin Netanyahu and just the larger criticism Netanyahu faces at home and abroad, the brunt of the White House criticism has been of the Israelis. And Blinken taking a moment here to say, reset everybody. Let's talk about how this all started and ensure that we're not letting Hamas get away with anything.
All right, time now for the speed read, starting with the economy from the Wall Street Journal. Inflation rose in March for the third straight month, 3.5% from the same time last year. So for a little bit of perspective here, this is better than the peak that we saw in 2022 when it was 9%. But it is still well above the Fed's target rate, which is about 2%. And it does signal that the road to interest rate cuts by the Federal Reserve might take a bit longer, and prices are going to remain high for millions of Americans. So the main drivers are housing and energy costs. They made up over half of the month-to-month increase for all of the items that go into the Consumer Price Index. And Moshe, the bane of my existence, grocery prices. Since March of 2022, the cost of groceries has spiked 25%, outpacing overall inflation.
Yeah, we've talked about this going back to 2019, actually. It's closer to 40% in terms of prices. When we talk about the inflation rate here.
Are you trying to kill me?
No, just context. Well, and Jill, if we go back to the 1970s, it's up even more. A dollar just doesn't get you much anymore. Jill, I do bring us on this day in history, so these numbers and years are important to me. Anyway, but in all seriousness, what we see happening here when you look at these percentages is this is a bucket of things that they look at to get this percentage. So how much is rent up? How much is gas up? How much are hotels up? And all these various factors that go into this percentage. Now, a little bit of inflation is okay for an economy. That's why they always talk about the target being 2%. You don't want to be at 0%. That means your economy is not growing. So 2% is the safe inflation rate. The issue we have is that it's really stubborn right now. We cannot get it below 3%. And that's what they were hoping for, to get back to 2%. So the question is, does 3 become the new 2 here, Jill, in this new reality? But one of the reasons why it's super important is because they want to get into the 2s again, because that means they can lower interest rates. Because the point of raising interest rates was to bring down inflation, which it did to a certain point. Again, the number 3.
So 30 is the new 20 and 3 is the new 2 when it comes to inflation.
And 40 is the new 30 and 50 is the new 40. But yes, inflation, 3% is the new 2%, Jill, because I don't know when we're going to get back to 2%, given the state of affairs in the world. The issue, again, is we had a lot of expectations this year in terms of interest rate cuts, that interest rates would start to come down again because inflation has cooled. Inflation is a stubborn thing. And so interest rates right now, the federal interest rate, which is just over 5%, but that impacts things like auto loans and other and credit card interest rates and all the other interest rates that are out there are impacted to a certain extent by the overall interest rate. So the bottom line here is we're still spending money. We're still buying things. Why is inflation high? Because we're still buying stuff after they increase prices. It's like what we tell you every time the inflation report comes out. It's the Taylor Swift song, "I'm the Problem, It's Me." Jill, if you get a group of people, like the whole country, to stop buying a certain item at a certain price, they will bring the prices down.
I think you're overestimating the power of my reach here. And Moshe,
yes.
A girl's got to eat, I mean, there's certain things that you just can't cut back on.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I'm just explaining the issue here, which is we can complain, but we are the problem in terms of how much we spend on things sometimes. And again, some of those are necessities, right? But if you cut back on certain things, if enough people cut back, then the people who are in charge of prices bring those prices down. Now, of course, it's not just due to inflation. We have seen companies that are raising prices for extra profits, and that's certainly been a frustration for many folks as well. That's something the White House brings up all the time, and Biden's tried to make it a campaign issue. Nonetheless, if you're expecting an interest rate cut in June, that is unlikely. The Fed will meet again in July, September, and November. The hope is they can cut it by November, but we'll have to watch these monthly inflation reports in the interim. And there are some folks at the White House, Jill, who are praying for an interest rate cut and inflation to keep cooling if they're hoping for a certain re-election for a certain president this fall.
Speaking of presidential elections, from the New York Times, in an unusual move, the 5 major broadcast and cable networks have prepared a joint open letter that urges President Biden and former President Trump to participate in televised debates ahead of Election Day. So this letter is endorsed by ABC, CBS, CNN, NBC, and Fox News. And it reinforces the question as to whether the traditional debates will occur this year at all. According to a draft version of the letter, it reads, general election debates have a rich tradition in our American democracy, having played a vital role in every presidential election of the past 50 years, dating to 1976. In each of those elections, tens of millions of people have tuned in to watch the candidates debating side by side in a competition of ideas for the votes of American citizens. Biden has repeatedly declined to commit to participating in the 3 debates scheduled for September and October. His aides say they are concerned that the nonpartisan Commission on Presidential Debates won't be able to enforce the rules when Trump takes the stage. If you remember back in 2020, when Biden and Trump first debated, it was pretty chaotic. Trump refused to follow some of the instructions of the moderator, Chris Wallace, and frequently talked over Biden.
Wait, Jill, let's play a clip, like one of my favorite clips from, there's a lot of interruptions to choose from, but here's one of my faves.
Make sure you, in fact, let people know you're a senator. I'm not going to answer the question because the question is radical left. Will you shut up, man?
Listen, who is on your list, Joe?
Who's on your list?
Right,
gentlemen, I think
this is so unprecedented.
He's going to pack the court.
We have ended this segment. We're going to move on to the second segment.
That was really a productive segment, wasn't it? Keep yapping, man.
The people understand, Joe.
They sure
47
do.
years you've done nothing. They understand.
All right.
So, Moshe, the debate commission actually had to tweak their rules for the final debate, which allowed a producer to basically mute each candidate's microphone while the other one had the floor.
Right. Remember that we typically always have 3 presidential debates and 1 VP debate. In 2020, there were only 2 because that interruption one we just played you a clip of, that was the first one. And then Trump claimed that the second moderator was going to be biased, so he effectively canceled the second debate. There was a lot of fallout, too, because they also discovered that Trump knew he had COVID and could have given COVID to Biden at that debate because he was standing several feet away. There's a whole story there about the number of people in the Trump camp that had COVID at that moment. Anyhow, they eventually agreed to the third debate, and they both show up there with Kristen Welker as the moderator, and that's where they had the mute button. So there's been a lot of back and forth here. Trump was like, oh, the debates are totally biased. I'm not going to partake. Now, recently, he has taken to saying, I'm totally going to debate. Biden doesn't have the guts to debate me. So the current White House is the one that's quiet here. Trump says, as of right now, that he would do the debate because he sees an opportunity to show that Biden, mumbles and doesn't have it all together. And so he believes that the debates advantage him based on what he believes he'll be seeing from Joe Biden in the fall. I would imagine, Jill, in the fall, there's going to be quite a loud number of – there's going to be a lot of loud voices telling the president that he has to debate, that it'll make him look weak not to debate. Notably, at his State of the Union speech, he looked like he had a lot of energy. In fact, Trump has said in an interview recently that he believes that Biden was on cocaine based on watching the State of the Union address. No, literally, Trump said this on a show. Why they would give our 81-year-old president cocaine is beyond me. But Trump said this recently, and so he might be like, like last time, he's like, I'm going to make you take a drug test before the debate. This is what our politics have dwindled into, descended into, but.
And by the way, it didn't get a lot of attention.
No.
I mean, it's the craziest thing.
No, Trump literally said, even the interviewer was like, all right, let's move on to the next subject. We're like, did he just accuse Biden of being on cocaine at the State of the Union? He's like, yeah, he had a lot of energy at the top, and then he faded at the end, like when you're on cocaine. Anyway, guys, Google
normal political discourse.
Guys, Google Trump and Hugh Hewitt, and you can listen to the clip. Anyway, back to the matter at hand here. So Biden performed well in State of the Union. The question is, in a debate format, can he hold his own with a moderator pushing back on him, with Trump pushing back on him? Trump may have learned his lesson from 2020 that he shouldn't interrupt him constantly, but maybe just let him speak, and maybe that will help him. Interestingly, in debate prep in 2020, fun fact, Chris Christie and Rudy Giuliani were prepping Donald Trump for those debates. Rudy Giuliani's strategy was interrupt him, be aggressive. Chris Christie said, no, rope-a-dope. Let him just kind of talk and mumble into a mistake and then get him. Well, needless to say, Trump followed the Giuliani advice, and Chris Christie is saying afterwards, if you followed my advice, you might have won re-election.
All I could say from a personal and professional standpoint, I hope there is a debate for the sake of this country, for the sake of our jobs, just for everything. It is important to see these candidates actually face-to-face discussing the issues. They do owe it, I think, to the American people,
and to face hard questions from those moderators. Chris Wallace is top of his game. Kristen Welker, top of her game. These are people who will have serious questions and challenge these folks in that setting, and that's important. And by the way, for those of you taking note, that Jill said since 1976, yes, that is accurate, because there were the 1960 debates between Kennedy and Nixon, but then there were no debates between then and 76. So there were the 60 debates, and then since 76. They've been a constant in our cycles.
All right, from ABC News, FBI Director Christopher Wray says the agency is working to prevent a coordinated attack from terrorist groups like ISIS-K. In a speech to the American Bar Association, he says foreign terrorists, including ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and their adherents, have renewed their calls for attacks against Jewish communities here in the United States and across the West. In both statements and propaganda, he notes the success that ISIS-K, the ISIS affiliate based in Afghanistan, has had with recent deadly strikes in Iran and Russia. He said the Israel-Gaza war is feeding a pipeline of radicalization and mobilization for years to come. The warning comes as experts predict that ISIS will try to carry out an attack on the United States. One analyst telling ABC, we should believe them when they say that. They're going to try to do it.
Yeah, you might have seen on our Instagram feed in recent days, we had the story out of Idaho of an 18-year-old who was inspired by ISIS literature and was about to carry out a strike on multiple churches in Idaho. And that's the way ISIS works. It's not like old school Al-Qaeda, where they brought a bunch of terrorists to Afghanistan, trained them in camps, had a whole strategy, we're getting them to flight schools, the whole deal. The way ISIS works is it puts out a lot of propaganda online, on social media, et cetera. The social media companies are trying to fight it, but there's Telegram channels and sort of the dark web. And it inspires individuals, lone wolves, they're called, to commit attacks. And that's what concerns the FBI, which, by the way, they brought down the guy in Idaho. They got to him early because he happened to contact an undercover agent by accident. But the FBI has to be right 100% of the time to prevent every single attack. So beyond ISIS here, Ray also spoke about state actors, the Russian government, the Chinese government, the North Koreans, the Iranians, in terms of the threat they pose here. He says that Russia right now is targeting underwater cables that are critical for global communication, internet cables. We saw a couple cut in the Red Sea, actually. It's believed it was the Houthis, though that's still unclear at this point. Then you have the Chinese government, who Ray says is playing, quote, the long game right now, trying to undermine the security and economy of the rest of the world. That speaks to the FBI concern about TikTok and the way they're going to slowly use TikTok to manipulate things. And part of the larger concern with the Chinese, as far as the FBI is concerned, is their cyber threat, is the amount of hacking that they're doing. And so he was recently very critical of the House Republicans, who cut $500 million from the FBI budget. Saying simply, China's not cutting their budget, we shouldn't be cutting ours.
From Reuters, the Earth recorded its hottest March on record, making it the 10th month in a row to break monthly global heat records. This is according to the European Union's Copernicus Climate Change Service. The all-time monthly highs were observed both in the air and in the ocean's waters. March 2024 averaged 14.14 degrees Celsius, about 57.9 degrees Fahrenheit. Remember, that's for the entire globe, which exceeds the previous record from 2016 by 1/10 of a degree. And it was 1.68 degrees Celsius or 3 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than in the late 1800s. That is the base that's used for temperatures before the burning of fossil fuels really started. Now, under the 2015 Paris Agreement, the world set a goal to keep warming at or below 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit since those pre-industrial times. Climate scientists attribute most of the record heat to human-caused climate change from carbon dioxide and methane emissions produced by the burning of coal, oil, and natural gas.
Now, one thing we should note is the other factor here in these record temps is El Nino. That's the, we go from El Nino to La Nina to El Nino in multi-year cycles out in the Pacific. And during El Nino years, that tends to change global weather patterns to increase certain heat waves. So El Nino is factoring in here, but they say it's pretty clear that climate change is bringing us to these record numbers. And Jill brought you a lot of numbers there. But one thing to keep in mind when we talk about the goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius, that we don't want to get above that. Why? Because then they believe that we'll start to permanently alter things on Earth. And given this last year was 1.68 degrees Celsius, we have now surpassed that limit, at least for a year. But because it's an El Nino year, they're not officially declaring it yet. And while this may not seem like a lot, 1.5 degrees Celsius or 3 degrees Fahrenheit, as we tell you here on the podcast, think about it like a human body. Here in the US, 98.6 is a normal temperature. If we're 3 degrees Fahrenheit above 98.6, which is what Earth is right now, that's a fever of 101.6. Well, how do you feel when you have a 101 fever going on 102? You start to feel fluctuations. You feel out of whack. You feel like crap. And so the sense is similarly, Earth, just a couple degrees warmer, throws things completely out of whack, throws the systems out of whack, that everything works in lockstep in terms of the oceans, weather patterns, the amount of ice there is, winters being a certain way, summers being a certain way. And what happens with climate change is it throws things out of whack. You start to see floods where you don't typically see floods. You see droughts where you don't typically see droughts. And then over time, things change permanently. And then people have to move their homes. And you're already starting to see what they call climate refugees. Anyway, I don't mean to be doom and gloom here at all, but this is, not at all, Moshe. Everything's fine. Nothing to see here. Everything's totally okay. I mean, like literally that meme with the guy at the kitchen table with the fire, like everything's okay, like sort of Earth right now. But listen, we are making moves in the right direction. If you look at what a number of countries are doing, is it enough? Probably not. Are we developing technologies to try to work with this? Adapt to this, but also reverse some of this? Absolutely. Is it enough? Not yet. And so, I think there's a lot of effort right now. There's a realization that, we've gone up to the edge, if not slightly over the edge in this last year. And so that'll mean that, more and more countries and companies will start to take this more seriously. And finally, from CBS News, Mattel is launching a new version of Scrabble designed to be more collaborative and accessible for those who find word games intimidating. It's their attempt to make the game more popular with younger generations, who data shows are just not as competitive. The new double-sided Scrabble board will still feature the original game for people who want to play that traditional version. But the new game on the flip side will include helper cards, use a simpler scoring system, and be quicker to play. The new board is called Scrabble Together, and it will also allow people to compete in teams. Mattel said the new board marks the first time in its 75-year history that Scrabble has made such a significant change to its classic board. They say for anyone who's ever thought word games aren't for me or felt a little intimidated by the classic game, Scrabble Together mode is an ideal option. So right now, this is only available in Europe, if you're interested. Not available in the US yet. This is based on research they gathered from British board gamers that shows that competitiveness is declining among younger generations. So based on the Mattel survey here, 35% believe that baby boomers are most competitive, millennials 31%, Gen Z 29%. So some headlines here is that this is geared towards Gen Zers who want to be more collaborative. They favor teamwork. They favor having more fun than sort of the cutthroat Scrabble players of a previous generation.
And Moshe, I was reading the comments on our Scrabble post, as I often do, and it seems like there is a collective eye roll to this change.
So listen, some people praised it. Some people said, listen, I have a I have a family member with dyslexia. I think this will be helpful to them. So some people praised this and said, the old game isn't going away. This is just the other side of the board, the flip side of the board. At the same time, we got notes like, everyone gets a trophy.
Right.
If you're intimidated by Scrabble, you have bigger problems, LOL. Does this game come with a participation trophy? Listen, people take their Scrabble very seriously, Jill. So some people are like, if you can't handle it, just go play Scrabble Junior for the kids.
I mean, look, I think it speaks to a more serious cultural divide between the generations and this idea of, like people are saying, the participation trophies. I do think this idea that younger generations just aren't as competitive is pretty interesting. I mean, have they ever been in a newsroom? It's like cutthroat. Well, I'd beg to differ.
So again, this is based on a Mattel survey of British people who play board games. So I'd love to get our friends at Gallup or Pew, get some reliable American polling organizations or global polling organizations to get a better sense of competitiveness. In fact, we should go send a note to our friend Mohammed who runs Gallup. And I'm like, listen, man, I want to see some real reliable numbers because I don't know if I trust the Mattel numbers here. But it is interesting nonetheless. Jill, I will say my wife Alex crushes me in Scrabble. It's like not even close. Like
really?
She's just good at it. She's incredible at, playing the math of Scrabble, like knowing how many points are associated with each. I mean, because really you can do your words, but if you know how to play the board to get a certain letter on top of double word score or triple word score, that's where you win the game. So there's a understanding of also like the words that are like 2-letter words that have Q's and X's in it. So anyway, kudos to my wife, who's a master Scrabble champion and does not need collaborative, easy Scrabble.
So you're telling me competition is alive and well in the Wanunu house?
It's alive and well, and I'm okay with it. We play Boggle sometimes. We play Scrabble sometimes, and she almost 99% of the time wins, and that's okay.
The biggest competition I have in my house with my husband, we do rock, paper, scissors, shoot to see who has to get the kids up in the morning. We'll hear the baby and my husband will just give me the fist of rock, paper, scissors.
How are you doing in rock, paper, scissors, Jill?
Meh.
I mean, it's sort of like playing roulette. You pick black or red. You got 50-50 odds. There's no strategy to it. All right, let's end here with On This Day in History. We begin in 1951. President Truman fires the most popular man in America, General Douglas MacArthur, who's the commander of U.S. forces in Korea. He was actually at the time calling for an invasion of China because the communist government there was aiding the communists in Korea. Of course, that war would end with a temporary armistice, right? North Korea, South Korea still technically at war after all these years. Though it was notable because the president fires the commander. He comes back. He's invited to give a speech to Congress. MacArthur addresses a Democratic-led Congress who invites him for a joint session, just given how popular he was. Truman was getting booed for this decision. And this is where the famous quote comes, "Old soldiers never die. They just fade away," MacArthur says in that speech. Though, of course, it turns out, if you look historically speaking, it was probably the right call not to invade China in 1951. All right, fast forward here to 1968. Lyndon Johnson, President Johnson, just a week after the assassination of Martin Luther King, signs the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which includes the Fair Housing Act, into law. And one more item from that era, 1970, Apollo 13, astronauts Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes blast off in what would be an ill-fated mission to the moon. Apollo 11, successful. That's the Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin mission. Apollo 12, you don't hear much about it, but they got to the moon as well. Apollo 13, they also wanted to get to the moon, but then an oxygen tank explodes a couple days later. You might have seen the movie with Tom Hanks and company. Eventually, they figure out a way to loop around the moon with lackluster power, splash down safely. several days later. And on this day in 1981, President Reagan returned to the White House 12 days after being shot in an assassination attempt in Washington, D.C., outside the Hilton there. It's been referred to as the Hinckley Hilton, up there, the Washington Hilton, because Hinckley, of course, was the man who attempted to assassinate Reagan. He was taken to GW Hospital, recovered, and then was back in the White House less than 2 weeks later. And one more item of presidential history. On this day in 2015, I think we've mentioned on the pod before, Jill, on this day in history, Barack Obama, Raul Castro officially met. It was the first meeting between the president of the United States and the leader of Cuba in more than 50 years. Of course, Raul, the brother of Fidel, who had passed away several years previous. The hope was it would put one of the more high-profile diplomatic feuds in the past. But of course, it continues to this day. Trump reversed some of that, and the issues in Cuba continue. We haven't quite, even 10 years later, really opened up ties. And we end, of course, with pop culture. On this day in 2000, 2 major hits released. Britney Spears gave us Oops, I Did It Again. And Jay-Z gave us Big Pimpin'. So, Jill, 24 years ago today, musical history.
They don't make them like they used to, Moshe.
Oh, Jill, Olivia Rodrigo would have you know, and Taylor Swift would have you know. You know. They're still cranking out hits, but Oops, I Did It Again and Big Pimpin', iconic. Iconic.
All right, we want to thank you for listening to the Mo News podcast. If you like what you hear, we would ask that you please share this with your friends. And I know I say this at the end of every single podcast, but if you could, it would really help us out. Just tell one friend about the Mo News podcast and share a link with them so they could actually listen for themselves. We would so appreciate it. It helps us grow. Also, follow us, subscribe so you don't miss an episode.
Yes, word of mouth pays. We posted on Instagram yesterday a note I got from somebody who was like, I just discovered your podcast last week, and I love it. And I love the way that it helps me digest all the news. I can't go through all your Instagram slides. So listening to the podcast gives me that opportunity to really digest things. So spreading the word is important. We also have Mo News, The Interview, that podcast. And of course, our premium podcast, where we have that conversation I told you about with the journalist who first broke the Nickelodeon story that led to the most recent documentary. So become a premium member today over at mo.news/premium. Just $7 a month. Jill, we haven't had to raise it for inflation yet.
Not yet. All right, everyone, have a great day.